Okay, I'm hoping that this is working. I know my last attempt at streaming didn't seem to stick, so I'm going to keep an eye out to see if people are able to see me and hear me. As I get a little bit more confirmation that this is working, technically speaking, and you can hear me, I'll get into the meat of our live stream. So it looks like people are logging on. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but we're getting it together now. So just a little bit about today. Today's AMA is going to be focused really on different roast levels, kind of the roast process that you'll notice with your different senses as you get going throughout the different roast profile. So I'm going to be kind of toggling back and forth between my screen where you can see me talking and going through a few different tabs of like some big macro photos on our website that will give you a chance to kind of see those roast levels in really good detail. Obviously, looking at the color is not always necessarily the greatest on a computer because so much of it depends on your monitor, but it'll still give you a good sense of kind of the texture and the different things that you're looking for. I'll also go over stuff that you'll hear, smell, touch throughout all of the different roast levels. Those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Ryan. I am the merchandise manager here at Maria's. I've been working in specialty coffee since 2018. I started as a barista and a cafe manager before making my way over to Sweet Maria's, where I've worked for about 2.5 years. Okay, the way that I'm going to get this started is just kind of walking through some of the basics of different roast levels, going through some stuff, then some people who submitted questions. If time, I'll try to touch on their questions, and then any questions that you guys want me to kind of address, try it in the comment section. I'll do my best to keep up, and if I don't get to your question, you can either follow up on Facebook and we can get back to you, or you can also send us an email at sweetmarias.com. We're always happy to answer your questions. A specific question, like you're troubleshooting a specific bean or something like that, a lot of times the best place to go because we can really take our time and focus on the particulars of what's going on with you. Okay, so I am just going to try and toggle over right here to another part of my computer. Let's see if I do this. Technical issues. Okay. Let's see. Okay. I want to. Okay. I'm having a little bit of toggling over to the tab on my screen that I wanted to show you guys. So I'm just going to start working my way through it. Some of you might have noticed, we're having a few difficulties with some of our library posts disappearing. So if I reference something that you guys don't worry, we're just doing a little bit of maintenance on the back end of our website. All of those articles should be accessible soon. So right now, I'm just taking a look at this roast levels postcard. So if you've ordered coffee in the last few weeks or even few months, you probably received one of these. It is a reprint of a postcard that we did a really long time ago, and it's really full of some great photos and some really good information about the different roast levels and what's kind of going on at each different stage of the roast. So give me just 1 sec to see if I can toggle over. Let's see. Okay, I'm just giving up. So if you're looking at the postcard, so I'm going to just kind of hold this up to the camera so it goes through. So apologies for the glare here. So first stage of the roast, you're just starting off with just green coffee right here. Again, if you go to our website, you can see just a PDF version of it, which might be a little bit better than, you know, my fingers close up holding this. Okay, so during that first green, the beans are going to be really cold. They're going to be smaller. You know, the first stage of roasting is going to be kind of moving through yellowing and into the drying stage. So during this stage, you're going to start seeing of kind of aromatic steam being released from the beans. It's going to smell pretty grassy, kind of like hay. This is when most of the moisture loss is happening with your coffee. A lot of the weight loss that's happening in the stages of the roast are actually going to be kind of like burning up the actual matter of the coffee, which is part of the reason why when you get a little bit darker, you lose a little bit of the origin character. A lot of those characters and those chemical compounds are kind of burning away and floating away as smoke into your fan or whatever kind of filtering setup you have. So it's going to smell pretty grassy, and this is a really nice development, especially for, you know, sometimes if you look at roast, I like to stretch out the drying phase a lot in my coffees, particularly with like a dry process coffee or something. It can be really nice with like an heirloom varietal from Ethiopia or like that, where maybe the coffees have mixed densities or are a little bit trickier, and catching out the drying phase can give a lot of the coffee a chance to kind of even out beans, and that way when you're going into like first crack and that thing, you can get a really kind of short, condensed, powerful first crack rather than something that's really long. Again, that's just my personal preference. That's one thing I like to do. There's a lot of different ways of kind of messing around with it and profiling. So don't think that anything is strict dogma, because it's just kind of my personal experience home roasting coffee. So once you're kind of moving through the drying stage, it's going to start transitioning from green to kind of a paler green, and then it's going to start going into a yellowing color. This is when you're starting to, once you get through yellowing, you're going to see a little bit of bean dimension happening. Not a whole lot yet, but it is going to get a little bit big and kind of turn from yellow to that kind of tan color. And once past that, you're going to start hitting the Maillard reaction, where things are starting to get a little bit thinner, get a little bit darker, and that's when you're going to first start to see drinkable coffee as you kind of move into first crack. For anyone who doesn't know about the reaction, I'm not a chemist and I did not study science in college, so I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but there's a lot of information about it online. It's the same kind of reaction that you see in any kind of browning of food, so it's similar to, you know, or other meat browns, or the way that bread kind of gets browner as you cook. So that's something to bear in mind with that. So once you start to move into crack, you're going to start hearing kind of like loud kind of pops. I would compare this to like popcorn popping. It's going to be pretty loud. You're going to notice it. Some coffees do crack louder than others. Again, depending on how you're roasting and beans itself, you can also have kind of a longer, prolonged crack or a shorter, more condensed crack. I tend to prefer a slightly shorter crack just because I think it's a little bit easier to control, but again, it's going to depend on the coffee and your personal preference. The first crack is going to be kind of the first stage where the coffee is drinkable. So the reason why you're hearing that kind of loud snapping is going to be that coffee is actually starting to crack open. So if you're looking at, I'm going to put a postcard here. If you're looking at first crack kind of here, so you can see there's that crease in the middle of the bean that you're going to see on all green coffee. So that's actually starting to open up. And if you look at some of the macro photos, which unfortunately I can't seem to figure out, show you the macro photos that I have pulled up on our coffee library, but or Sweet Maria's macro coffee picks, or the one that I'm actually looking at called Sweet Maria's macro coffee It's going to start out with some really great kind of cross sections and photos of green coffee, and then it's going to start moving down into roasted coffee. So I'm going to start talking a bit. So getting into city, one more thing about the reason why I bring up that it can be longer or it can be shorter. A lot of times we get questions like, how long is first crack? When should I be measuring first? Very first pop? Should it be at the very last pop? Like, what does that all mean? That's part of the reason why I like to kind of stretch out the drying phase on a lot of my coffee, short contained crack, so I can really see start, stop, and kind of and use some other cues, particularly like smell, audio, those kinds of things, to figure out exactly what my coffee is in its roast process. I think I mentioned this in an earlier AMA. If I'm really going for a straight city, stop my roasting while I'm still hearing the last few pops of first crack, and I'll let it finish flame tray. That's a good way of kind of hitting like that lightest light roast. If there's like an aberrant pop, like there's one pop but the rest of the coffee is still clearly in stage or is still pretty tan, then I won't necessarily count that. Sometimes there's a weird bean in there that's a bit earlier than the rest. Usually once you've heard like kind of popping, start my timer. I'll see how long first crack goes. I'll time when first, kind of make my moves from there. Again, that's just really good data taste, especially if you're trying to kind of figure out where you might have gone wrong with the roast, or how to apply some of the articles that we have about roasting theory. How long first crack happened, how long the drying stage was, is going to be really helpful for you in terms of your roast as you move along. So moving into plus roast. So the crack is starting to open up a little bit. That's why you're noise, it's an exothermic reaction. So the coffee is suddenly going to be heat. That's going to really quickly turn back into an endothermic reaction where the coffee starts away. That's one of the reasons why, even if you want to pull back kind of like during or after first crack to keep the coffee from running away, you want to make sure that you don't pull back the energy too much, because it's transitioning from thermic to endothermic so quickly. You don't want it to lose too much energy. For those of you who are really interested in roast curves, and you're looking at your ROR curve, so your rate of rise, which you want to like leveling out like that. So the ROR going down, the rate of rise is going down, but you don't want it to actually, if that makes sense. So you don't want it to be rising as quickly as it was, but your rate of rise to actually go into negative. That's where you're going to kind of hear about stuff, or where you're going to start to pick up on some of those less pleasant baked flavors. It's all need a really high temperature to roast coffee well and get it tasting really well. To roast on too low of a temperature, no matter how brown you get, it's still a little bit baked. I think this is also anyone who doesn't follow us on Instagram. Tom recently afternoon posted a really interesting article, or some, I should say, where he kind of walked through different and showed that even though coffee looked really good and really evenly roasted kind of in the roast, if you went back and looked at the early stages of the roast, there's a lot of tipping, there's a lot of splash. So I know sometimes we have a tendency during those kind of early stages of the roasting where it's moving from green to yellowing to tan, sometimes we have a tendency to not pay as close attention as we do once we get to first crack and beyond, because trying to zero in on our roast level. But if you're not careful at the early stages of your roast, get really dark or get uneven or those kinds of things, even if it evens out later in the roast, you're going to still taste those kinds of roasting mistakes in the end of It's all very important. Okay, so just kind of walking through some of the visuals. It's still going to be relatively splotchy in color. You're getting some lighter browns. A lot of times we'll get questions from people being like, even roast, and it's because they're doing a very light roast and there's just going to be a natural variation. If you just roasted until all of the beans looked uniform, then you'd probably full city plus French roast every single time. So don't worry too much about uniform. Generally look pretty good, but a little bit of variation is natural. You can always take a picture and send it to us in an email and we can take a look for you. Of the taste at the point of city roast, the brightest roast, it's going to have the most kind of acidity and pop. A lot of times citrusy notes at this really early stage of the roast. This can also be a really floral stage for the coffee. It's going to have a lighter body, round mouthfeel in general. In terms of smells, you still might malty, grainy smells that you smell earlier in the with getting through the Maillard reaction, and some kind of herbal notes as well. It's going to smell kind of like baking bread, I would say. And if you actually feel the texture of them, it's going to be like a little bit bumpy and uneven. You're also not going to notice like that kind of shine or sheen that you might see at later stage. And once I get there, I will kind of explain why that is. This is pretty hard to measure exactly, but probe in your roaster, this can be kind of helpful just for reference. That in the bean, when it hits first crack, is usually going to be between like 415 and 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, I think specific temperatures can be more confusing for people, especially since a lot of carry with their temperature probes are kind of reading different things. So it can be confusing if you're like, my roaster doesn't even get up to that number of degrees. Don't worry about it too much. Okay. After you get through first crack and into kind of city roast, you're going to pretty quickly move into city plus roast. Again, this is really similar visually to a city roast. You might have softer edges around the end, or the crease in the center might have opened up slightly, but the city plus roast, different people are going to name it different things, and it can be as little as a minute of roasting depending on your roaster, so that transition happens pretty quickly. It definitely isn't a thing where I can look at a bean and be like, oh yes, this is definitely. It kind of, as you roast the bean and take a look, I'll be like, city plus, somewhere in there. Then you're going to start moving in full city roast. So with a full city roast, you're going to be, in terms of the surface texture, it's still going to have some surface texture to it, but that stuff is going to start kind of evening out a little bit, get a little bit darker. Of course, the crease is going to open a little bit more. Edges are going to be further softened. In terms of you haven't quite hit second crack yet. They're expansions, so you're going to see your beans getting a little bit bigger. In terms of the smell, out of those kind of bready, malty smells into more kind of like a weird to describe it as bittersweet, but something like that. I'm going to start to see a little bit of a sheen when you get to full city roast. The reason why you see oil there and that little bit of shine you don't see in the city roast is because the actual cell structure of beans itself is starting to break down. So have it expanding, a lot of moisture is reaching out, and that's what's kind of forcing the bean of that moisture. With the full city roast, moving towards kind of the cell structure is starting to break down, and some of those coffee oils are going to move. That's why you're going to see a little bit more shine as you get there. Again, there's going to be less chaff as well because that crease is opening up and it's from the inside of the bean. Darker, it can also start to kind of like burn away some of the chaff. So that's another part of the reason why it's going to have so much more chaff than darker roasted coffee. Full City Plus, you might just be starting to hit when you're in full very first snaps of second crack. Second be much softer compared to first crack. You can hear it, but I would say it's almost more like we call it snap because it's like snapping twigs almost rather than popping popcorn. I've described it before as like putting milk on top of rice, crackling sound. That's going to be second crack versus first crack. Those of you who are roasting on poppers or something like that, where it might move really quickly from first, and you think, oh, I just got through first crack, and then we look at the beans and say, oh, that's a French roast. Listening to the crack can be really helpful in kind of determining where you are. If it's those really robust pops, or if it's more of a soft crackling, which kind of signifies that you crack. So you're going to see a lot more oil. If you look at the surface texture, it's going to be really smooth. There's going to be far more expansion. It's really remarkable how much larger a French roasted bean is compared to like city roasted bean. For instance, short anecdote, I roasted some coffee darker for my parents and sent it to them. Extra, so I figured I'd try it out. And the cup that I usually use to dose out my full dosing amount of the darker roast because the beans were so much bigger roasted. Just something to note. So noting that a lot of those things that people kind of grow up opening the coffee, super strong smells, seeing that kind of smooth bean on their coffee, that's all kind of indicative of a really dark roast. Because it's not always the greatest. For instance, we get a lot of questions about kind of like why when I'm opening my coffee I'm not getting that same burst. And there's a few different reasons for that, and it can depend on the coffee. But if you're getting a lot of those aromatics in the coffee, especially before you've even ground it, that stuff is actually exiting the the bean itself. It's going into the bag, it's going into the air, so you're smelling it there, but all of that stuff that you're kind of getting in the bag is flavor and aromatic components that aren't going to make their way into the cup. I like to keep it all in the bean as much as possible as I can. All right, so I highly recommend checking out photos in our library. It's really helpful. I'm sorry that I couldn't show a bit more detail. The Sweet Maria's macro photos have sections of like green coffee. It's going to kind of show you how different beans look, different by side. It shows you a coffee cherry. It also shows you parchment, which I think is really interesting. If you're interested in mix and damage and that kind of stuff, check out more coffee pics. There's a lot of kind of insect damage. There's some cool up close photos of coffee, but it shows you like what a sour looks like in a white bean. Some of the kinds of rarely ever going to see in Sweet Maria's coffee, but you might, ground and roasted already in, a can of coffee that you get at bodega or corner store. I think these are really helpful, especially if it looks a little bit weird, or like a lot of people who have ordered for the first time look at their coffee and they're like, this looks crazy. This doesn't look anything like that I got. And so that can kind of reassure you that you got are not defective. We actually have an article, I'm not sure if it's available right now, with our library that specifically talks about the appearance of soup. I think is really helpful. Kind of walks you through some of the reasons for that difference in appearance and the different processing methods. Okay, so I am just going to really quickly touch on some of the questions ahead of time, and then I'm going to do the absolute best I can to address all of the other questions that you guys are typing in. Thank you again so much for checking in with us. Any questions we don't get to today, I'll make sure to get to in my next live stream, so please continue to tune in. So one thing that we've gotten a lot of questions about kind of since our last few live streams is profiling in the gene cafe, how to apply some of the Stretching the Roast articles, those kinds of things. And then kind of discrepancies, because I talked about one of my favorite things, stretching out the drying stage, or some of that kind of seems to go across or go against some of the advice that we give the tip sheet. So I just wanted to start out kind of generally talking about the tip sheets, the functions of those, and just kind of reiterate that this is not us telling you that this is to do it. This is the absolute way for every single bean. This is going to give you the best results. Our intention with the tip sheets is to kind of walk through some safety features, walk through some stuff that hiccups, that kind of thing that we hit on, and give you an idea of where to start. So definitely don't feel like you can't ever move away from the things that we discuss on the tips. We always think that experimentation is great, and we love to hear from you about how you kind of got these really great. For example, on the Gene Cafe, it says to keep it at the highest temperature the whole time. It says to keep it cold, whereas I like to preheat it. So there's variation, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. That's kind of what I would say. I would also, and this is something that I would like to kind of add to our product description of the Gene Cafe. With the Gene Cafe, a big thing is kind of roasting a lot of roaster, getting to know it, and getting to know its kind of response time. So experimenting with turning the temperature at certain points, turning down the temperature at certain points, and seeing how long it takes for that to translate into a change in the readings that you're seeing on themselves, just because every machine is going to act a little bit differently. Once you kind of have an idea of the reaction time of your particular unit and how long it's going to take it to heat up or cool down, it's getting more information about if I want to stretch this out, I should turn the temperature down at this stage because it's going to take this long for it to actually do that, and that's when I want that particular shift in temperature to happen, that kind of a thing. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the Gene Cafe, I love it because the visuals are so great. It's so easy to use. It almost always does a really great job kind of giving you a nice, even roast. And it's kind of a fun mix between an air roaster because it's pushing that hot air into the chamber, and a traditional drum roaster. But it's not the best machine for you if you really want to mess around with roast profiles, charts, and kind of changing up your for every single coffee, just because the controls are a little bit more limited compared to some of the other roasters we carry, because you can only adjust temperature and the length of roast. Especially now that some of the fresh roast models have higher capacity, if you kind of were interested in the Gene because you wanted to be at least 8 ounces every time, there are other roasters that will allow you to do that. Might be a little bit easier for you to kind of mess around with your profile from roast to roast. Not saying you can't profile in Cafe, it's just a lot more challenging compared to some of the other roasters that allow you to for airflow and that kind of a thing. We've also gotten a lot of questions recently about degassing, why you're doing that, what the ideal rest time is for your coffee. So I want to just kind of touch on degassing. During the roasting process, a lot of carbon dioxide is being produced, and a lot of that kind of stuck in the bean. This is going to be especially true for a lighter roast because there's less expansion, there's less down of the structure of the coffee, the internal cell structure, so more of the those are going to be trapped. It's going to take a little bit longer for them to dissipate compared to a darker roasted bean where it might need a little bit less rest. Reason I would say sometimes I'll give my lighter roasts a little more rest compared to like a darker roast where you want to kind of use it up a little bit faster. 12 hours I'd say is the absolute minimum. I almost always wait at least 24. And I'll say in my experience, just doing light roasts, mostly City Plus, and doing mostly kind of like pour over and brews at home, I tend to notice peak freshness around like 3 to 5 days after roast. That's when I really hit kind of like the sweet spot for my coffee. But again, that's completely personal preference. The character of the coffee is going to continue to shift as it degasses and as it gets older after roasting. And there's no right or wrong answer about when it's going to be best. And it's very subjective because some people might really like some of the kind of funkiness that you get when there's still a lot of CO2 in there and when it hasn't finished degassing. Although I tend to notice that it's a little bit roastier. If I've ever roasted something and then immediately brewed it, I'm just getting roast components rather than tasting the bean, even with a really roast. So no right or wrong answer. I'd say try to give it at least a day. And also a fun thing to do, especially if you're roasting a larger batch, split it up and kind of chart how it tastes from day to day and start to zero in on where it kind of hits your personal preference for what's best. Occasionally, if you look in our coffee reviews, we will mention if a coffee we've noticed needs a lot more rest or can benefit from a little more rest. Brew application is a matter. So doing a pour over coffee, manual drip, you might want a little bit less rest time. For something like espresso, if you're roasting and brewing your own espresso, I like to do a little bit more rest just to give the coffee a little bit more time to stabilize, makes it a little bit easier to work kind of dialing in your espresso. When I worked in cafes, we would do our best to never open a bag of espresso until it was at least a week off roast, usually preferentially 10 days off roast. So that's just my 2 cents about degassing. Okay. Yeah. So City Plus. Okay. So I think that gets us through most of the pre-submitted questions. One person does ask, and I want to give them a shout out, and how to kind of tell when you're at the different roast levels when you're going to be more. The be more is tricky because it only has that little window where you can see, and it has that orange light while it's roasting. So determining color and those kinds of visuals can be a little bit harder when working with the be more. So with the be more in particular, I really listen for cracks and for some of those other cues from smell as well. So in addition to keeping an eye on the beans, really listen for first crack. You want to make sure you get through first crack roast, and then you can use your timer and other cues to kind of map exactly where you are. When you start hearing those first few crackles of full City Plus, it means or of second crack, it means you're at full City Plus. I think the Be More, one of the nice things is, even though it's a little bit trickier to see, kind of judge those visual cues of roast development, it's pretty quiet and it's really easy to hear the crack in that, compared to something like the Gene Cafe where you have really awesome visibility, but because of that app for chaff collection, it can be really tricky to kind of hear past that and listen for the cracks, especially if it's a that doesn't crack super loudly. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to really quickly try to scroll through some questions that were submitted as comments, and anything that I can get to again, we'll try to either get to in our next AMA or send us an email. I'll be happy to kind of answer your questions one-on-one. Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of people kind of say it's hard to monitor color change with the Be More. There's really an aroma change between yellow to tan. Jonathan Wong, you asked that question. It's all going to be that kind of like grassy bread smell and that kind of drying state of the roast. I wouldn't worry too much about the particulars of yellow to tan. There's not going to be a lot of adjustments that are usually being made at that period. It's going to be more once you are moving from tan to browning and seeing the Maillard reaction, and it looks like a city roast and you're just waiting to start to hear those cracks. How long are drying phrases? Good question, Mark. It's going to depend on your batch size. It's going to depend on the beans you're using and kind of what you're trying to get out of the beans. If you haven't checked out Stretchin the Roast articles, those are some of my favorite, just because I think they kind of break down actually building your profile versus specific profiles for specific coffees. Oh, Keith, this is a great question. Sometimes you get savory notes in Kenya, tomatoes and beefy notes. So is that an underdevelopment issue? It depends on whether or not you think unpleasant flavors. Personally, and maybe this isn't my opinion, but I love a super tomato forward Kenyan coffee, and likewise, if I'm Kenyan espresso and it comes out with that kind of like meaty umami soy sauce, I'm pretty pleased. But that can definitely be something that people talk about with a little bit of underdevelopment with a Kenyan coffee. So trying to develop it a little bit deeper, or even stretch out your first crack or a little bit of your drying phase to kind of give it a little bit more time to develop, might bring out more kinds of citrusy flavors or bright flavors, those kind of poppy citrus notes that a lot of people associate with Kenyans versus those more savory flavors. Again, what's a defect? What's a symptom of underdevelopment? And what's just a pleasant coffee? Really subjective. Oh, I'm sorry, my audio is cutting out, so I'm just starting to see that. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully the audio won't cut out in the final video that we post. Try to review that. Really sorry, I'm just starting to see all of the comments about the audio issue. I wish I had a good answer for you for why that's happening, and I'm sorry that it is. We're getting to the end of this right now, so I'm going to take a look at some questions and try to answer those in writing. If you couldn't hear what I was saying, and I'm so sorry. Hopefully the internet will be a little bit more compliant for our next live stream. Thanks for checking in, and happy roasting, everybody.